Night was falling quietly on a small town in Maine as Elizabeth Harrison closed the door to her home. Lily, her daughter, had gone out to meet friends, leaving her mother in the lonely comfort of a large room with dim lights and the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But today, Elizabeth was not alone. She was waiting for the one who had become her forbidden but necessary hobby. David appeared quickly and silently. He came in like a storm, reserved but determined. At 19, he seemed too self-confident, with a look of maturity and a certain audacity that stirred up feelings in Elizabeth that she had long thought forgotten. The difference in age between them only added flavor to their encounter, for she felt young and desirable, and he felt strong and invincible. They stood in silence for a few seconds, looking at each other. Their eyes met, and immediately filled the space between them with a tension that did not require words. David made the first move, his hand touching her shoulder, gently, as if asking for permission. Elizabeth sighed lightly, and for a second felt hesitant, but the passion burning inside her drowned out any hesitation. She allowed her fingers to touch his hand, feeling the warmth transmitted from him like an electric current. Their encounters were rare, but each one was full of hidden power and emotion. Elizabeth instinctively felt that they were playing with fire, but that didn't stop her. Each touch of David's awakened in her what she thought she had lost long ago, a taste for life and an unquenchable passion that made her heart beat faster. David leaned down to touch his lips to her face, and Elizabeth bowed her head, giving him freedom. He kissed her slowly, gently, but with each kiss her desire grew stronger. She tried to restrain herself, but something inside her pulled her to him, making her forget everything else. To forget that she had a daughter who loved this guy. To forget that she was breaking all the rules. To forget that in the end, it could destroy them both. They merged in an embrace, searching for each other with a desperation that almost reached the point of obsession. Her body responded to his touch, as if nature itself had blessed this connection. But in the back of her mind, Elizabeth knew that it wouldn't last, that every time they were this close, it could be the last. In a few hours, Lily would return home, and they would be strangers again. David will leave through the back door, leaving behind only the subtle smell of her perfume on his shirt. Elizabeth will be left alone, and in the morning she will be greeted by silence and routine, in which their secret meetings turn into unspoken thoughts and desires. However, that night, while they belonged only to each other, the world seemed different, calm, almost perfect. They plunged back into their embrace, but deep down, Elizabeth felt something invisible, dark and threatening looming over them both. Elizabeth Harrison had always been a strong woman. She lived in a small town in Maine, where every resident had a story to tell, and every new event was instantly known to everyone. Elizabeth got married early, and it seemed that her life would follow a standard scenario: husband, home, children. However, after a few years, her marriage broke up. She was left alone with a young daughter in her arms and had to build a new life. At the age of 45, Elizabeth became a woman of strong character who was used to overcoming difficulties on her own. She successfully worked at the local library, where she was respected for her intelligence and sophistication. She seemed to be happy with her life, although at times she felt empty. After her divorce, she had several short romances, but none of them could fill her inner loneliness. And then David appeared in her life, young, full of energy, unpredictable. David was a stranger to this town. His family had recently moved here from the big city, and he quickly attracted attention for his appearance and mannerisms, which were different from the others. David had something elusive in his eyes, a mixture of reckless independence and childlike self-confidence that attracted others. He was young, but he had already experienced life more than many of his peers. There were rumors that he left home because of some problems, but no one knew the details. This only added to the mystery of his image. Lily, Elizabeth's daughter, became infatuated with David immediately after they met in a local cafe. She was surprisingly innocent and naive at the age of 19. After a strict upbringing by her mother, Lily was just beginning to discover the world outside the home, and David, with his frankness and freedom, was a revelation to her. They quickly began dating, and Lily was happy, believing she had found someone who truly understood her. It took Elizabeth a while to realize that her daughter's young boyfriend was not looking at her as a future mother-in-law. At first, she didn't pay attention to his attentive gaze or the way he held his hand for a long time when they greeted each other. But over time, these small details began to form an unpleasant picture. David was not just her daughter's boyfriend. There was something in his gaze that rekindled old desires that Elizabeth had been trying hard to suppress. David saw Elizabeth as more than just a mature woman. He liked her confidence, her life experience, the way she was different from young girls. She was a mystery to him, inaccessible, and in a sense, even dangerous. But that was exactly what attracted him. He felt that it was a risk worth taking. The secret connection between them became more and more risky and stronger each time. They hid their relationship because they knew that the truth would destroy each of their lives. Elizabeth realized that her life was hanging in the balance, but it was impossible to back down. She plunged into the affair completely, becoming less and less cautious with each meeting, forgetting about the danger that could await them. Their connection was an explosive cocktail of secrets, passion, and fear. All three of them were caught up in a whirlwind of events that was steadily approaching a tragic ending they never knew they were going to have. Their secret meetings were always planned for those nights when Lily was staying over at friends' houses or staying overnight at college. Elizabeth would come up with more and more elaborate scenarios to hide their meetings. They met in places where no one could see them: small, rented rooms on the outskirts of the city, remote coffee shops in neighboring towns where they could forget about reality for a few hours. Each meeting was filled with emotional tension. They both knew that they were breaking all the rules, and that's what made every moment more poignant and exciting. When Elizabeth saw David, she was overcome with a feeling that was both inspiring and frightening. She felt alive, as if she had returned to her youth. And in those moments when he embraced her, she forgot about everything: her life, her responsibilities, even Lily. However, a feeling of fear always haunted her. One evening, as David walked her home from another secret meeting, she noticed a shadow flicker in the darkness beneath their house. She thought someone was watching them, and a cold sweat ran down her back. She quickly pulled David aside, but that anxiety stayed with her. It was hard for her to know if it was real fear or a play of her imagination, driven by guilt. Soon after this incident, Elizabeth began to notice other little things that hinted more and more at the risk she was so afraid of. One day, Lily returned earlier than planned and found David in the house. Of course, they quickly explained it away as him just coming to see her, but Elizabeth felt that her daughter was becoming more and more attentive to both of them. Lily might not have realized their connection, but Elizabeth knew that her daughter was beginning to suspect something, although she might not yet fully realize it. One evening, after another meeting, David suggested that Elizabeth stay the night together at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. She hesitated, realizing that it was risky, but she couldn't resist. That night, they spent time together, relaxing as if there were no dangers, and Elizabeth allowed herself to surrender completely to the moment. It seemed to her that in that silence, in that remote room, they were the only two left, protected from the rest of the world. But the morning quickly brought her back to reality. She knew she had to get back to her life, her responsibilities, and her daughter. Every time they were alone, Elizabeth promised herself that it would be the last time. But each of their last times repeated itself over and over again, as if they were being drawn in by a force from which it was impossible to escape. They could not stop. Lately, the tension in Elizabeth's home had become palpable, like a thick fog hanging in the air. The relationship between Elizabeth, David, and Lily had become a complex triangle in which everyone was playing their part, unaware that they were playing a dangerous game. David, who had previously seemed balanced and cautious, now felt consumed by unbridled jealousy. When Lily was around, he behaved as a boy should, attentive and caring. However, in the moments when his eyes met Elizabeth's, a hidden passion flashed between them that they could not contain. And although they tried to act like normal people, it was becoming increasingly difficult. Every glance, a casual touch, even a quick involuntary sigh were silent signals they exchanged in Lily's presence. David, who had once longed for freedom and lived an easy life, now felt that he wanted more. He wanted control. Elizabeth was his secret treasure, and he couldn't allow anyone else, not even Lily, to have a place in her heart. With each passing day, this obsession became more and more noticeable, especially for Elizabeth, who was beginning to realize that her sense of control was slipping away from her. One day, when Lily came home unexpectedly, Elizabeth noticed David trying to calm his irritation and jealousy. Lily was chatting cheerfully about her friends and planning a weekend away, unaware that there was a secret in her home that threatened everything she knew and loved. A disturbing shadow flickered in David's eyes as he looked at Lily, and Elizabeth couldn't help but feel that cold breath of danger. She decided to talk to David about their connection and express her concerns, realizing that their meetings had become too risky. One evening, when they were alone again in a cozy cafe, Elizabeth cautiously started the conversation, trying to lead him to believe that maybe it was time to end the game before things went too far. But David didn't want to hear it. "Are you saying that's it?" His gaze was cold and hard. Elizabeth hesitated, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt him, but would still get her point across. She was alarmed at how much he had changed. The guy she knew a few months ago seemed completely different. She was frightened by his inexplicable obsession, which seemed to grow with every meeting they had. "We can't go on like this, David," she finally said, trying to sound calm. "And Lily doesn't deserve this." At these words, David narrowed his eyes, as if considering her statement, and then leaned closer. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice sounding strangely different. "And I won't let you go. I'm not going to let this end." Elizabeth suddenly felt a cold fear. His words sounded so serious that she felt something akin to panic. David no longer looked like a young man driven by a forbidden passion. He had become a man ready to do anything to fulfill his desires. She tried to change the subject, to distract him, but she already realized that he would not listen to any persuasion. This conversation made Elizabeth feel the anxiety creeping in again. Every day she saw David, his eyes became more penetrating and intrusive. She realized that she was risking not only her own life, but also her daughter's peace and safety. However, the bond between them was too strong to break. It was like a tightening abyss from which it was impossible to escape without loss. That evening, when Elizabeth returned home, she decided to be more careful, but David was not going to back down. He considered her his own, and this conviction became more and more evident in his actions. And even as Lily unsuspectingly talked to her mother about the upcoming weekend with David, Elizabeth felt that their every word, every step was turning into a dangerous game in which they could all become victims of their own feelings. Elizabeth felt that she was getting more and more entangled in the web of her own feelings, from which there was no way out. Every time she thought of David, she was simultaneously overcome with passion and fear. His attention and desires, which had once attracted her so much, now seemed obsessive, almost frightening. She felt as if David was losing control, that he would do anything to keep her close. But where could she go? She knew she had come too far to just walk away. David, in turn, was becoming more and more intolerant. He noticed that Elizabeth was trying to create distance, and it scared him and made him angry. In his young heart, a sense of ownership was born that defied logic. He began to control her meetings, her days, even her views of other people. When they were alone, he constantly interrogated her, trying to make sure that she belonged to him alone. One evening, when they met in a small motel on the outskirts of town, a fight broke out between them. David didn't come in as reserved and cold as usual. He was agitated and nervous, almost angry. His eyes were burning in an unusual way, and even when Elizabeth tried to calm him down, it only made him angrier. "I see the way you look at me," he suddenly said, barely able to contain his anger. "You think you can just walk away from me, don't you? You think I'll just disappear from your life, like I don't exist?" "David, you're exaggerating." Elizabeth tried to calm him down, but her voice was shaking. "No, you're underestimating me," he replied coldly, moving closer to her, making her feel trapped. "I know you're thinking of leaving me, but I'm not going to let you." Elizabeth felt herself panic. She realized that this time it wasn't just about their relationship. David was no longer in control of his emotions, and his words had become a threat. His face, contorted with anger and pain, left no doubt that he would not stop until he got his way. She took a step back, trying to draw his attention away, to make him realize that she needed space, but David moved behind her, as if he didn't notice her fear. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," he continued, almost whispering, but his words cut like a knife. "You are the only one who understands me, the only one who has accepted me. And you think I'm going to let you go?" His voice was quiet, but it sounded threatening. Elizabeth tried to change the subject, trying to calm him down, but he was unmoved. She realized that she was no longer in control. Their relationship had turned into a game of survival, and she suddenly felt not part of a passionate connection, but a prisoner of someone else's obsession. Meanwhile, Lily began to notice changes in David's behavior. He became aloof and nervous, and often avoided her when she tried to talk about their relationship. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. One day, when she happened to stumble across David's phone, she noticed several messages sent at night that he had hidden from her. They were short phrases, cryptic hints of meetings that she couldn't explain. Lily didn't know how to react to this discovery, but doubts began to eat away at her from the inside. Elizabeth could see Lily beginning to ask questions, but she was also afraid that she would solve their secret. Every time Lily mentioned David or asked questions about his behavior, Elizabeth felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She realized that if her daughter found out the truth, everything she had built over the years would collapse in an instant. However, with each passing day, David became more and more persistent. His calls and messages turned into controlling and harassing. He began to show up at places they hadn't agreed to meet, unexpectedly coming to her house even when Lily was there. He was no longer afraid that their relationship would be discovered. On the contrary, he seemed to be looking for it. Elizabeth realized she had to find a way to stop it. She could no longer stand his constant control, his senseless obsession. However, she realized that any attempt to break the connection could lead to dangerous consequences. David had already shown her that he was not going to back down. Realizing this made her feel anxious, which became a constant shadow in her life. She knew that every step they took was a risk, and that something inexorable, dark, and irreversible was coming for them both. That night, there was an uneasiness in the air, a heavy autumn wind swaying the trees outside the window, leaving their bare branches shivering in the gusts of cold. Elizabeth knew that this day would be different. She could feel it in the morning when she woke up in her bed, with a heavy feeling in her chest. She finally decided to end the relationship. David's obsession, his unhealthy desire for control, scared her more than she was willing to admit. She realized that she had allowed them to go too far, and that she had to put an end to it. Lily, her daughter, was supposed to go to a friend's house for the evening. Elizabeth was the only one left in the house, and her thoughts were piercing her brain like poison. She knew David wouldn't let it go, but she couldn't put up with his obsessive behavior any longer. She had to take back control of her life, even if it was scary. David showed up at her door as soon as Lily left. He came quickly, almost defiantly, as if he knew she would be waiting for him. Elizabeth opened the door, trying to remain calm. Her gaze was cold and focused. "We need to talk," she said firmly, trying not to let her fear show. "I can't do this anymore, David." He stood in the semi-darkness, his face in shadow, but she could see his jaw tense. There was a cold menace to him that was unaccustomed to her, and it made Elizabeth even more afraid. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm, but his voice was shaking. "That's it. I don't want to continue our meetings anymore," she said slowly, each word coming with difficulty, but she had to be decisive. "You can see for yourself that we're both only suffering from this." "You just want to leave me?" His voice was full of anger and pain. Elizabeth took a step back, feeling his energy fill the room. His face no longer expressed the usual confidence and calm. "David, please, no more drama," she said. "We have to end this. We have to put an end to this," she tried to explain, realizing that she was no longer in control. "No!" David suddenly grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight. "I can't let you just walk away. You're my everything, Elizabeth. You can't just give up on me." Elizabeth tried to pull her hand away, but he pinned her against the wall, his face close to hers, and she felt his breath burning her skin. "David, you're scaring me," she whispered, unable to hide her anxiety. "I don't want this." But there was no stopping him. Her words only fueled his anger even more. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her sharply against him, as if he wanted to force her to make the decision that he believed would ruin his life. Elizabeth realized that she had lost control of him and the situation. She tried to escape, to break free from his grasp, but David was stronger. Anger and jealousy clouded his mind. He could not stop, even when he saw the horror in her eyes. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he pushed her away so hard that she lost her balance and fell to the floor. Her head hit the edge of the table, and the room plunged into silence. David stopped, stunned by what had happened. He looked at her motionless body, and gradually it began to dawn on him what he had done. She was lying motionless, her eyes closed and her face pale. His breathing became ragged, and he tried to get closer, frightened by what he saw. David touched her hand, but she didn't react. Her body remained motionless and cold. Guilt and horror began to overwhelm him. He realized that his obsession, his unhealthy desire for control, had led to a fatal end. Everything he had dreamed of, everything he had fought for, had now turned to rubble. David remained standing there, looking at her. He knew that there was no turning back now, that his life had changed forever. Detective John Mason arrived at Elizabeth Harrison's house early in the morning. He had decades of experience in investigations, but even for him, the place looked eerie. The death of a woman whom everyone in town knew had shocked the small town. Everyone here tried to guess what had happened behind the closed doors of this quiet home. Mason began by carefully examining the crime scene, trying to notice everything, even the smallest details. There was an oppressive silence in the room where Elizabeth's body lay, her face still in a look of horror, and there seemed to be a trace of violent emotional conflict around her. The first detail that struck Mason as odd was the shoe print on the carpet by the bed. The shoe was not her size and did not even belong to the usual women's shoes that Elizabeth wore. The footprint looked fuzzy, as if someone had tried to wipe it off, but Mason was good at noticing these things. The footprint appeared to be male and felt somewhat fresh, left in a rush as the perpetrator ran out of the room. When he got closer to the bed, he noticed that its surface was crumpled, as if there had been a struggle or someone had sat there trying to quiet their thoughts. Elizabeth's bed, which was usually neatly made, looked strange. Mason noticed the scattered bedding and assumed that there might have been a quarrel or conflict that ended in tragedy. Then his eyes landed on the dresser, where there was a picture frame. The photo showed Elizabeth and Lily smiling, happy, as if nothing could separate them at that moment. But the frame stood at an unusual angle, as if someone had inadvertently touched or turned it over. This seemed suspicious to the detective. Criminals often try to destroy photos that depress them because they depict those they have lost or betrayed. This gesture could be a subconscious reaction of someone who felt guilty. Mason began interviewing Elizabeth's closest friends and acquaintances. Her colleagues at the library said she was reserved, polite, and had an excellent reputation. She focused on her work and was always supportive of her daughter, calm and even somewhat reserved. Her life seemed to be stable, so no one could assume that she could have any enemies. However, in conversations with a few friends, Mason began to notice an interesting nuance. Elizabeth had recently become distant, sometimes not answering her phone or suddenly disappearing in the evenings. Some speculated that she was having an affair, but no one knew the details. She seemed to be carefully hiding this part of her life. Mason decided to talk to Lily. Elizabeth's daughter, shocked by her mother's death, seemed confused but also avoidant, as if she was hiding something from the detective. He asked her about the last weeks of her mother's life, trying to understand whether Elizabeth might have had a relationship that would have influenced her or led to the tragedy. Lily reluctantly admitted that her mother had become distant recently and that she may have had personal problems. However, during his conversation with Lily, Mason noticed how she mentioned her boyfriend David. From what she said, he realized that David had been acting strangely lately, disappearing for several hours and returning with a tense look on his face. Lily's eyes were full of anxiety, and she admitted that she had begun to suspect him of infidelity. Her words hinted at the fact that doubts about David had appeared in her life. Mason gradually put the pieces together. He began to suspect that David might be involved in something more than just an affair with Lily. His sudden disappearances, changes in behavior, and strange hints in Lily's behavior suggested to the detective that David and Elizabeth might have been involved. With each new piece of evidence, with each conversation with Elizabeth's friends and colleagues, Mason began to suspect that there was more to the death. He had no proof yet, but his intuition told him that David was more than just Lily's boyfriend. His name was coming up more and more often in witnesses' stories, and the motive for the crime could be much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Realizing that he was on the trail, Mason decided to call David for a conversation. He planned to find out more, to see if this guy could explain his ties to Elizabeth. For Mason, this investigation had just begun, and it seemed that more and more small details that seemed insignificant at first began to form a single picture that gradually brought him closer to solving the terrible mystery of this crime. Detective Mason was convinced that every detail he collected was leading him to the truth. Gradually, he pieced together a picture from disparate pieces that hinted at a secret and destructive connection between Elizabeth and David. But to prove it, he needed more evidence, more information that would connect them on an emotional and physical level. David came to the conversation with Mason with a reserved confidence, but his eyes gave him away. His eyes avoided meeting the detectives, and his movements seemed forced. "Tell me about your relationship with Lily," the detective began, watching David's every move. "Lily and we were together," he muttered, his voice suddenly cold. "I loved her, or at least I thought I did." This answer alarmed Mason. He noticed the way the boy's lips trembled as he spoke these words. It seemed that there was a whole other story behind this phrase. Mason decided to take a chance and ask him directly. "What can you tell me about your relationship with her mother? You spent a lot of time at their house, didn't you?" This question stunned David, and he held his breath and tried to maintain his composure. His eyes instantly filled with anger, but he quickly suppressed the emotion, answering with emphatic calm, "Elizabeth was special, but I was with Lily. That's all." Such a defensive tone left no doubt that there was a connection between him and Elizabeth that he was trying to hide. Mason felt that he was getting closer to the solution, but to gather all the evidence, he needed to find the testimony of others. The detective reached out to Elizabeth's friends and neighbors, hoping to find more hints to the mystery that seemed to be hidden from everyone. During conversations with some of the neighbors, he learned that they had seen David come to Elizabeth's house several times when Lily was not home. Although none of the neighbors knew the exact details, they thought it was strange that a guy would come alone when his girlfriend was not in the house. Next, Mason decided to investigate Elizabeth's personal belongings. He looked through her diary, notebook, and phone, which were found at the crime scene. In the text messages, he came across several short, almost coded phrases that were sent between her and David. The messages were discreet, but the detective realized that their connection was much closer than Lily or anyone else dared to think. With the new evidence in hand, Mason decided to talk to Lily again, trying to learn more about her mother's last days. Lily seemed depressed and exhausted, but she was as frank as ever. "Lily," the detective began cautiously, "did you ever feel like there was a special connection between your boyfriend and your mother?" Lily looked at Mason, puzzled, and her face went white. She shrugged her shoulders as if she was fighting the thoughts that had arisen in her mind. "There were times when I saw them together and it seemed, I don't know, it was weird." Lily nervously clenched her hands together. "I thought it was just my imagination, but sometimes it seemed like there was more to them. They were avoiding each other, but at the same time, it didn't seem natural." Her confession confirmed Mason's suspicions. Lily felt there was a tension between her boyfriend and her mother that she couldn't explain. It meant that her mother and David had a special connection that they were carefully hiding. After talking to Lily, Mason returned to the crime scene, looking at each piece of evidence from a new angle. A footprint on the carpet, a crumpled bed, a photograph taken at a strange angle, all pointed to intense interaction between the victim and the perpetrator, as if there had been an argument before death that had gotten out of hand. Now the detective had both a motive and a suspect. David's obsession, which was mixed with his jealousy and rejection, became an obvious factor in the case. He saw Elizabeth as more than just the mother of his girlfriend, and, having lost control of his desire, he brought the situation to a tragedy. All that remained was to collect the last pieces of evidence to close the chain and press charges. Mason knew that David was already on the verge of confessing, and that just talking to him could make him confess. Detective John Mason was ready for the final conversation with David. The evidence collected, the testimony of neighbors, and Lily's suspicions created a strong chain that connected the young man to Elizabeth and the horrific crime he was trying to cover up. But now that all the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, Mason knew it was time to expose the truth. He set up a meeting with David at the police station, and he showed up, though he looked tense and tired. His eyes were empty, as if the weight of his own guilt was beginning to press down from within. Mason felt that the young man was ready to confess, but he needed a final push. "David, I hope you understand why you're here," Mason began, watching the young man's reaction. "I've already told you everything I know," David said, trying to avoid the detective's gaze. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and this did not escape Mason's attentive eye. "You know, your words may not mean anything when I have so much evidence in front of me," Mason said, holding up the crime scene report. "We found footprints on the carpet that matched the size of your shoes. We found the messages you sent to Elizabeth. And there are multiple witnesses who saw you arrive at her house without Lily. Do you realize where this is going?" David froze for a second. His eyes lit up like a cornered animal. He realized that he could no longer keep his secret. "She and I," he began, clenching his hands into fists. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was an accident. I didn't plan it." "Then tell me what happened that night," Mason asked calmly but insistently. David looked at the detective, as if torn between the desire to remain silent and the need to speak. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice quiet and uneven. "It all started with Lily. She brought me to their house. I met Elizabeth, and she was so different. She understood me. She accepted me. I felt that she—" He was silent for a moment, trying to find the words, but she wanted to stop it. She said we were making a mistake, that it had to end, and I couldn't accept it. I lost control. Mason listened in silence, letting David continue. "She said it was over." His voice shook. "She said she didn't want to see me anymore, that I was destroying everything around me. I didn't understand how she could say that after everything that had happened between us. And then I grabbed her. I don't know what came over me. Just anger, desperation. I couldn't stop myself." "And you pushed her away," Mason concluded, helping David speak the truth he'd been holding inside. "Yeah," David whispered, lowering his head. "I pushed her away and she hit. She was lying there and I knew it was over." His confession hung heavy in the air. Mason sighed, realizing that he was looking at a broken man, caught up in his own fears and passions. But the law was the law, and he knew that David had to be punished for what he had done. "David, this is a hard confession," Mason said, "but it doesn't change anything. What you did has consequences, and now you have to face them." David didn't answer. His face was pale, and he stood silently, as if finally accepting his fate. Mason called the patrol officers to take him away. Before they took him away, he turned to the detective, his eyes full of despair meeting Mason's. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said, almost whispering. "I just couldn't let her go." Mason didn't say anything, just watched as they led him down the hall. He knew that the tragedy of this story was not only the crime, but also the destroyed lives left behind. Obsession, passion, and jealousy had woven themselves into a web that had trapped all of its participants in a fatal trap. When the door closed behind David, Mason was left alone with thoughts of Elizabeth's ruined life, Lily's pain, and the inevitability of how sometimes small details and unexpressed feelings can lead to irreparable consequences. David's trial became a sensation for the small town. Residents watched every day of it, discussing details, testimony, and everything that became known about the double game that Lily, her mother Elizabeth and young David were caught up in. The local courtroom was packed when the hearings began, and everyone in attendance waited with bated breath to see what would happen. In court, the prosecution presented all the evidence collected by Detective John Mason: a shoe print on the carpet, signs of a struggle on the bed, messages that reflected the intense and secretive relationship between Elizabeth and David. A key moment in the case was David's confession during interrogation, confirming his involvement in the tragic events. He tried to justify himself by saying that he had lost control under the pressure of emotions, but this did not make a proper impression on the court. Lily also took the stand in court, and her testimony was painful and moving. She spoke of her love for David, his changes in behavior, and her suspicions that had begun to emerge before the ill-fated night. The tears and emotions in her words became one of the most powerful parts of the trial, emphasizing the tragic nature of betrayal and loss. The judge, having heard all the testimony, delivered a verdict that was discussed by everyone in the room. David was found guilty of the murder of Elizabeth Harrison and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His lawyer tried to reduce the sentence by appealing to the defendant's young age and emotional stress, but the judge found that his actions were premeditated and dangerous to society. David had no way of avoiding punishment for his fatal act. After the verdict was handed down, David did not say a word. He stood motionless, looking down at the floor, as if at that moment he realized the consequences of his decision. The courtroom fell silent, and the townspeople realized that the story had ended as it should have, with a just punishment for someone who had allowed his obsession to destroy his life. A year has passed since the verdict. Lily left the city, but the memories of the tragic event remained with her forever. She found refuge in a big city where no one knew her past, hoping to start a new chapter. Life had taught her a cruel lesson. Sometimes people you trust can turn into enemies, and that love can destroy you if it turns into an obsession. Lily often thought about her mother and tried to keep the bright memories that remained from the time when their life was peaceful and simple. She visited a psychologist in an attempt to free herself from the burden of guilt, as she often felt responsible for the events that destroyed her family. She learned to live again, but found the strength to forgive herself and move on. The story of Elizabeth Harrison became not just a case in a criminal archive, but a lesson for everyone who knew the family. Residents of the city will always remember her as a silent warning about how hidden passions can destroy lives, and that some relationships, even the most intimate ones, can be more dangerous than they seem at first glance.